So we're only 5 days removed, but it's one of the most famous stories of the Bible, right? In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. So one interpretation of the Star of Bethlehem is that it was a miracle, a one-time event that happened and has not been repeated ever again. But what if it wasn't a one-time event? And what if we could actually examine events of that time period and perhaps determine that this was something that we could know about and know further things about? And that's what this talk is about. So tonight, you got to be a number of things with me. We are going to be Sherlock Holmes, but we're also going to be historians and archaeologists and linguists, and most of all, perhaps, astronomers. And we'll need all these disciplines to understand what the Star of Bethlehem may have been. So let's start out as historians and linguists for a moment. Our first task is to narrow down in the great timeline of the Bible. We need to figure out where roughly we are. And our first clue comes from the very first part of this passage. So, what I want to focus on, and of course you're all Greek scholars, I assume, right? So, the first thing we want to talk about is this phrase, wise men. It turns out wise men is the translation of that word in Greek. And that word in Greek, as some of the translations accurately talk about, is magi. Or more specifically, megoi, which became magi. Well, what do we know about the Magi? It turns out we know quite a lot about the Magi because they're recorded in many other books and many other documents that have survived from the time period. And the Magi belonged to this area of, they were part of this Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire were the people that had actually been responsible for the stop of the expansion of the Roman Empire eastward. And then, as now, they were fierce warriors, actually. And one of their great strengths was cavalry. They knew how to use horses. And that was something that the Romans weren't very good at the time. So that stopped the expansion of the Roman Empire to the east. Well, then, we have to ask ourselves, how come so frequently we get this translation of magi to wise men to three kings? Well, the Magi were actually involved in the election of the Parthian Empire's king. And so they were astronomers and astrologers. And that's a word, of course, those two words, astronomer and astrologer, were things that were really identical at the time. You were both. You were responsible for knowing things about the stars and the movement of the stars so that you would know things about the season of the year and keep sort of track of calendars, but you were also responsible for knowing what this meant. And so they got this tag of wise men. That role that they had in electing the Parthian royalty is how it appears that we end up with three kings. They weren't actually kings themselves, they were more king makers. So that seems to be how we ended up with those additional titles for them. So we're trying to get our time frame down. Big deal, Right? Parthians, the enemy of the Romans, traveled into Jerusalem. How was this possible? Well, what was happening is, we know from about 36 BC to AD 58, there was a sort of détente with the Parthians and the Romans. And in fact, we know that Caesar had told Herod, don't tick them off. Right? Your job is not to, I don't want a war with these guys right now, so don't start a war. So one of Herod's major duties was to make sure that the peace was kept. Well, if you think about that phrase, and all Jerusalem was troubled with him, well, of course Jerusalem was troubled. We had an enemy company coming in directly into the heart of our empire. This was not a comfortable thing. And much like kind of the kerfuffle that happened when we were starting the détente with Russia, you remember that? I mean, it was a big deal. Well, if a company of Russian soldiers had accompanied them into our land, it would have been a big deal. So part of what I alluded to is this was probably a very large company of Parthians that was coming into Jerusalem. It wasn't just three. It was probably a fairly large caravan that had traveled across the desert to reach Jerusalem. So there were a lot of them. Small city still at the time. It's a big deal to see all these guys coming in. But that does help us to narrow down the time frame even further. So I wanted to say, we need to get our Herods straight. There's a lot of them. Right? The two big ones, though, the one we're referring to now is Herod the Great. And this is alleged to be a portrait of Herod the Great. Herod had sons, and the Herod that we know from the time of Jesus, in fact, every other gospel reference is Herod Antipas. Okay? But this Herod the Great is the one that we're interested in. Now, why are we so interested in Herod the Great? Well, this handsome fellow over here, that is supposed to be a portrait of Josephus. Right? And most of us have heard of Josephus. Josephus is our favorite Jewish, Roman, secular historian of the time period. Now, Josephus was later, he was, I think, in about 70 AD was when he was principally doing his writing. So he's also reflecting back. But he's about the closest and most detailed historian we have. Well, Josephus is very particular about when Herod died. And Herod, this is generally accepted by scholars. Right? There's always some noise about, well, is this right? Was it 4 BC? You can even see it down to 1 BC. I've seen it all the way back out to 8 BC. But in general, we mark this according to a lunar eclipse. So a lunar eclipse back in those times was a momentous occasion. When the Earth comes between the moon and the sun, for a brief period of time, the moon turns a very reddish color. Right? Well, back in the day, that portended great things. So there's this, Josephus records a lunar eclipse just before Herod died. So we feel pretty good about that date. All right, so now we've narrowed things down. So our next step is now we need to shift over and become a little bit more astronomers. Now, as Professor Kaufmanis would say, don't worry, not too much, but we do need to remember some things and perhaps learn some other things. So, if I ask you to imagine standing directly on the North Pole, which feels about the same today anyway. What you would see is Polaris, the North Star, we pointed that out to you, would be directly over your head. And if I asked you to stand there through the night, you would notice that the Big Dipper, which most of us are familiar with, begins to make a transit around, it begins rotating around Polaris. Of course, it's not the Big Dipper that's rotating at all, right? It's the Earth that's rotating. Now, if I bring you down to about Minnesota area, you start to get a picture that looks like this. You can still find the North Star. So again, you start to see this horizon now comes into view. Well, of course, it's not just Polaris that we're seeing, right? We can see all the different constellations, right? We've got Gemini over here and multiple other ones. And just for completeness, the Big Dipper is one part of a larger constellation, Ursa Major, which is the Great Bear, which is why you see this extra piece. Here's, of course, I mean, you can see this readily, can't you? Feet here, there's a tail on the bear, here's the head of the bear. I think it's obvious. Right? All right. So again, you're watching all the constellations begin this rotational thing. And of course, why is that? Well, we're rotating to the east. Okay? So the Earth is rotating to the east, and that gives you that apparent circular bit. But now, what happens if we turn now? Imagine yourself turning now. Now you're going to look to the east. Well, what you get is a rising of the constellations. So different constellations have come into view, and hopefully you can see the difference. You can see Gemini and Cancer are now higher in the sky, and Leo is following behind it. And here, Gemini and Cancer have risen even further, and Leo is more fully visible. So what's kind of interesting is that the constellations follow along this narrow band in the sky called the ecliptic. Not elliptic, ecliptic with a C. Right? So just keep that in mind for later. But basically it's the sun, the moon, and these constellations all travel along this band called the ecliptic. So the next piece of information I need you to remember is that constellations also have a season. So on January 21st, you really can't see Capricorn and Aquarius, right? Because the sun is between us and those constellations. So when the Earth spins around during a normal day to look towards the sun, that's where they are. Okay? So now I have to bring in another thing here, and it gets a little spooky for some people, but we need to talk about it, which is the zodiac. All right? And the zodiac, I'm not talking about the late 70s, early 80s version of let's look at the zodiac and look at our horoscope in the newspaper. The zodiac was known 1,000 years before Christ was born, and it was exceptionally important to the astronomers and astrologers of the day. Because as you can see from this diagram, what happens is by knowing what constellations are in the sky, you know what time of year it is. Okay? So you're marking time, which is, of course, is very important because if you want to plant or do other things, you don't want to do so too early. All you do is get your crops killed by the frost. So knowing the zodiac was important, and they were exceptionally clever. They divided the zodiac. They had 12 signs of the zodiac. So they had divided the night sky up into these 12 zones of the zodiac. That's not an easy concept. I mean, put yourself back 3,000 years and think about how wise and how smart you had to be to figure out that these things were coming around at a regular length of time and that you needed to divide the sky up and somehow name these things. I think it's extremely impressive. Okay. So, the next piece of information I need you to know is that one of those constellations, Pisces, was associated with the Jews and was actually called the House of the Hebrews. So our friends, our astrologers, astronomers, when things happened around Pisces, they would think of this would be representative of the Jews. And some people speculate that Pisces, the fish, is where the genesis for the Christian fish came from. Right? So there's some trace all the way back to this time in history about where that fish symbol may have originated. Okay. I know, you're all getting tired of astronomy, aren't you? Okay, somewhere. In addition, the next piece of astronomical information I need you to know is that the time when this constellation reappears. Remember a moment ago I told you constellations disappear for some period of time during the year. Well, when they reappear, just before sunrise, heliacal, helios, the Greek helios for sun, right? Heliacal rise, that was a very important event for our very early astronomers. because they could mark that and say, aha, I know what time of year it is now. And so watching this thing come up was extremely important to them. All right, well, so far we've talked a lot about constellations. Okay? And constellations are interesting to the early Greeks, the Parthians. Lots of astronomers of the time are very interested in them. But they were also called the fixed stars. Well, because these things always stand in relation to one another. They're not fixed in the sky, they're fixed relative to one another. So when Pisces is here, Aquarius is always going to be here. That's always going to happen. So while they were interesting, they weren't nearly as interesting as these wandering things, these stars that would appear in and out of the picture. I mentioned the ecliptic, which we see as that kind of vertically rising line off to the right. Well, the ecliptic is really the path the Earth makes around the sun. That's what makes the ecliptic happen. Right? So as the Earth is rotating around the sun, that's what creates that plane. Make sense? Everybody with me, more or less? Well, here's an interesting thing that really stopped me in my tracks as I was researching this topic. It turns out that in our solar system, all the planets live on the ecliptic. Well, I'm not an astrophysicist, but if you're an intelligent design person, this certainly got my attention. Like, why would all these things be on the same plane? I don't have a good answer for you. But it's fascinating. So, in all the great astronomy, these things line up almost like this. This is a little dramatic and a little off, but basically they're on the same plane. So, more information for you. Jupiter was the king star. So the astrologers of the time had identified that as a marker for important things related to kings. And Saturn was known as the star of the Messiah. So its position and its tracking and things it did in the night sky were important to announce the coming of a Messiah. All right, so again, now you're all Greek scholars, so you should readily recognize what I'm interested in on this slide, right? That word is sometimes translated Anatolai with an I, and it's a plural word. And the translation is east. And Anatolai or Anatolan, which I'll show you in a second, always means east. But this word east appears twice in this phrase. And here it is the second time. And I'm sorry it's down low for those of you farther in the back. Does anybody notice anything? It's spelled different. It's spelled different. And here's the thing. As I said, Anatolan or Anatolai as it's sometimes translated, always is east. Anatole with an E has two different meanings depending on context. Sometimes it's east, and sometimes it's heliacal rising. And by the way, I verified this with Father Welsbacher. So I feel pretty good about that statement. Well, what does that mean then? Well, what it means is Kaufmanus thought this is exactly what the wise men, the Magi, saw that got them excited. They saw at a heliacal rising Jupiter and Saturn together in the house of the Hebrews. And this was the great sign that sent them moving towards the west. Now notice there's another clue in there, right? This is happening at sunrise in the east. If the star was a miraculous thing that appeared, first of all, over Jerusalem or Bethlehem, right? It would be in the west. So we saw its star at its rising in the east. Well, that tells us another thing, right? That tells us there was some information in that rising that said, don't go east, go the exact opposite direction, go to the west. Well, I think this is why the argument makes a lot of sense to me, because this had to have had a clear association to the Parthian astrologers. The wise men must have known this was what was happening. This was the sign for them. By the way, this kind of conjunction hadn't happened for at least 800 years. So they had not seen this for at least 800 years. That's why I showed you that graphic before. If you noticed, remember how slowly Saturn and Jupiter are sort of tracking each other and going around? They don't come and get near each other from our perspective very often at all. But it wasn't just a heliacal rising, because the next thing that happens, and this is sometimes called the greatest conjunction, we'll talk about that, over the course of the year, actually the year was 7 BC, over the course of that year, from April of that year, the heliacal rising happened on April 12th. Notice here in this graph, Jupiter and Saturn are very close, and I didn't quite keep the same scaling. But they got this close in about May of that year, and they started separating again for a while. Well, they got close together again in October, and on December 1st as well. They came into this true conjunction where they were very close to each other. Well, so if you're, again, Magi, and you're thinking about or watching some of this happen, this is a big deal. So you're probably asking, well, Steve, when can I see the next one? And I am very happy to report that it will happen in 2238. So if you are planning to be around, this is the same time frame as the Star Trek Enterprise. So please give my regards to the crew of the Enterprise. But that does tell you just how rare of an event this is in order for this kind of thing to happen. It doesn't happen very often. So it would have been very important to them. Okay, so now we need to add just a little bit more archaeology. I think it was in 1857, in Mosul, then called Nineveh, a gentleman named Laird discovered a huge trove of clay tablets. Look like this, cuneiform tablets. And they're called cuneiform because the stick that's used to do this drawing, that was used as a writing instrument at a time, is a triangular stick called a cuneiform, so cuneiform tablet. And this very tablet, as far as I can tell, I actually got a picture of the very tablet. On this tablet and multiple other tablets, if you could translate that, which I can't, but if you could translate that, you would find on this tablet the phrase, Jupiter and Saturn in fish. Jupiter and Saturn in fish. So we have absolute, incontrovertible proof that the astrologers, astronomers of the time, saw the event I just showed you. There's no doubt. They saw it, they knew it happened. The event that was the Epiphany, that sent these men on a journey of 1,000 miles, I hope that in my brief little talk here, I've given you a reason to just pause and look at the night sky. And as you look at that and you see the wonders of God in that night sky, it encourages you to go on your own journey to find the Christ child. Go ahead.